The title of her talk is Expanding Form in Literary Journalism, Feminist Hybrid Writing as Research Creation.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, just to begin. Poet Daphne Marlett argues that writing should always represent the essence of a person's identity because, as she says, the texts we write are woven in / are the very fibers of our tissue text. So it's a little experimental writing that Marlett wrote. I'm going to encapsulate what I'm talking about. Is anyone here familiar with poets Daphne Marlett or Wesley Lowery? Okay. We see here an obvious inseparability of the written body and poetic corpus and the actual matter of the poem, the stuff of the words themselves. But it was upon reading the collaborative embodied writing of West Coast writers Daphne Marlett, as I mentioned, and Betsy Worland that led me to the hybrid experimental works of feminist icons Hélène Cixous and Gloria Anzaldúa, as we see here. As someone who writes poetry myself, I of course was naturally led to question, what form-breaking texts can expand conceptions of how literary journalism is crafted? How might the form of literary journalism be queered in itself? And what freedom would this queering or experimental play with traditional forms afford the writer? I'd like to invoke here the use of poesis, or imaginative play and making, to invite everyone here to consider how two texts by Cixous and Anzaldúa, which I'll point out in a minute, might be considered as ideal models from which to garner some inspiration to perhaps experiment with form. I'll turn first to the writing of Hélène Cixous, who, for anyone who may not be familiar, is a French feminist writer affectionately known as one of the mothers of post-structuralist feminist literary theory. I point to her 1997 book, written in collaboration with Muriel Gruber, called Rootprints, Memory and Life Writing, which I had great difficulty categorizing for the purposes of explanation in this paper. I've deduced, as best I can, that Rootprints is a pastiche of dialogue and poetry, stream of consciousness theorizing, journal notes, and play with punctuation, as I'll show you in a minute, communicating, from what I've interpreted, a partial autobiography of how Cixous writes and reads. It presents, in other words, a fragmented and beautifully chaotic self-portrait of the writer. So this is the first slide here. This is one of her first pages of her book, Rootprints, which I've been talking about. It's structured as a conversation or dialogue between her and other author Muriel Gruber, as I mentioned. And the white space, as you can see, kind of throws the reader into this abyss of conversation. The reader is immediately within the book and part of the conversation as a reader. And I'll tie this into how we might use this in literary journalism in a moment. This second slide shows a page further on in Rootprints. Instead of focusing on what Cixous and Gruber are saying or what is literally written there, I invite you to examine the shape of the writing on the page, the use of quotes from Cixous' research journal placed in the block shape, the dialogue form, different fonts, and the layout of the text which invite reading from various angles. So you're kind of just immediately thrown as a reader onto the page. This is my favorite slide here. I'll read it out loud to you as best I can. One cannot talk about it without attitudes, positions, dispositions, and we don't really need to know what she's talking about, of the body and of the soul, or even mechanisms. Muriel Gruber. One cannot talk about your work if, from the outset, one ignores the 30 or so books of fiction you have written. What is most true for you is poetic writing. Then Cixous. What is most true is poetic. What is most true is naked life. I can only attain this mode of seeing with the aid of poetic writing. I apply myself to seeing the world new, that is, almost to enumerating the world with the naked, obstinate, defenseless eye of my nearsightedness. And while looking very, very closely, I copy. The world renewed is poetic. So here, Hélène Cixous plays heavily with punctuation, repetition, and figurative language. So I'll now turn to the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, who some of us may be familiar with. She is a Chicana cultural and queer theorist who is the author of a piece of work perhaps a little bit more commonly known than obscure Hélène Cixous' text. It's called Borderlands and Afrontura, the New Mestiza, and was written in 1987. It's an unconventional text fusing autobiographical essays and poetry in Chicano language and plain English. In this particular section, Anzaldúa relates her identity via the traditional process of tortilla making. So you have here part recipe, part poem, and part essay, so the Spanish there, she steeps the corn in lime, it swells softened. The stone roller on metat, she grinds the corn, then grinds again. She kneads and molds the dough, pats the round balls into tortillas. And here she transitions into poetry. We are the porous rock in the stone metat, squatting on the ground. We are the rolling pin, el meyaz agua, la masa barina, somos el majillo, somos lo molido, and all metat. We are the comal sizzling hot, the hot tortilla, the hungry mouth. We are the coarse rock. We are the grinding motion, the mixed potion, somos el mojate. We are the pestle, the comino, ajo, pimenta, and she goes on. And Zaldívar is literally hybrid bilingual text, reflects a hybrid subjectivity which crosses the intangible boundaries between Latina and American, and more broadly is reflective of her physical border-crossing identity. The writing itself, as breaking traditional essay form, is queer, and as James Heckert notes, queer is derived from the German queer, to cross, adding another level of complexity to Anne Zaldívar's written identity. Harkening back to Marlitte's opening words, that the texts we write are the very fibers of our tissue, it seems that both Anne Zaldívar and Six-U are concerned with presenting the truth of their identities, a wholeness of their beings, no matter how imperfectly, quote-unquote, they are represented on the page. And perhaps it is this imperfection or imperfectness that captures who they are. As Six-U states bluntly, as we heard, what is most true is poetic, and what is most true is naked life. For me, this brings to mind the mission of a literary journalist, a mission concerned with representing, above all else, the truth of one's subject and the truth of an experience. And I'm thinking here, in particular, to the new journalism movement. In this sense, if we consider literary journalists who are indeed taking up the mantle of social justice as practitioners of a kind of arts activism, a means of creative resistance, we can view their writing as hybrid practice positioned at the intersection between creative expression and political activism. A kind of writing which exposes truth or injustice, which in turn carries the potential to inspire political action against oppressive power dynamics stemming from racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, etc. At the very least, this creative resistance should be interpreted as a productive and subversive form of research creation, which I define loosely as the melding of scholarly practice and art. Writing itself then becomes a transformative process. Hélène Six-U urges, writing presents the very possibility of change, a springboard for subversive thought. Adopting the more radical techniques of Anne Zaldívar or Six-U in the writing of literary journalism could reinforce the element of poetic inquiry inherent in some literary journalism already. That is, returning to Six-U, representing naked life. True life becomes a form of art by employing poesis or imaginative construction. Considering the examples of Six-U and Anne Zaldívar, and taking further inspiration from literary theorists Laurel Richardson and Elizabeth St. Pierre, experimentation with the literary journalism form could be seen via the production of layered text or pastiche, engaging in collaborative writing, so not simply research, but actual process of writing with another person, which Six-U and Gruber do. Transforming interviews into poetic representation, producing visual text as pieces of literary journalism, or producing choreographed or performative pieces as pieces of literary journalism. In other words, experimentation with form entails maximizing intentional, mindful play in writing and queering the very form of literary journalism through this experimentation in play. The use of hybridity in writing can be considered a methodological approach reflecting the principles of intersectionality. Hybrid writing operates, in the words of scholar Roberta, as a creative and political mode of destabilizing not only complex social allocations, but also research frameworks. This leaves me with my final question. What freedoms would this queering or experimental play with literary journalism form for the writer? And perhaps more importantly, how could it hinder the goals of a literary journalist? If the goal of a good piece of literary journalism is to craft voices or a voice of the subject or subjects as close to the truth as possible, then offering voice as a stable human identity produced via one homogeneous form may be less effective than, say, a counter-storytelling technique like Anne Zaldívar or Six-U, who in effect gracefully cobbled together a patchwork of textured, layered writing pieces representing a multiplicity of voices, of unfinalized, unfixed, and shifting identities. Now, I recognize that it is possible some literary journalists may be interested in getting their work published. If this is the case, and one is intent on experimenting with form as I've suggested, perhaps a very trusting and eager editor or publisher would make the best fit to ensure publication, unfortunately. Nevertheless, I think it is at the very least interesting to consider potential directions hybrid writing might take the literary journalist and arts activist practitioner. Thank you.
Our next presenter needs no introduction. Roberta Maguire is professor and chair of the Department of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, where she teaches African American literature and literary theory. Currently, she is co-editing the Routledge Companion to American Literary Journalism with William Dow. Her paper today is part of another work in progress, looking at the implications of aesthetic choices made by 5 African American literary journalists during the 20th and 21st century.
Thank you very much. Last November, Wesley Lowery, a national reporter for the Washington Post, published his first book, They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. He witnessed the development of the Black Lives Matter movement while covering local responses to a series of police shootings from August 2014 to April 2015 that resulted in the deaths of unarmed black men, from Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, to Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Maryland. His book, he explains in his introduction, was based on his reporting notes from those 9 months, the articles he published between Brown's and Gray's deaths, and hundreds of interviews he conducted over the next year. It is a gripping narrative incorporating many of the markers we assign to literary journalism: emotionally charged dialogue, scene-by-scene construction, and detailed descriptions of the emerging movement's leaders in action, how they dress, move, and talk. What Lowery leaves out of the list of materials he used to create his book is himself. As the first-person narrator, he is the crucial ingredient that marks this as a 21st century text in the long tradition of African-American literary journalism. A bit of background. The first person has been a marker of the journalistic tradition in the black community from its beginnings in 1827, when the focus of the black press was on the abolition of slavery. Journalistic subjectivity remained central to advocating the African-American cause during the years of Jim Crow segregation and throughout the 20th century civil rights movement. I've, for a while now, been probing the function of that first person, at times combined with the second person, looking at how the use of voice shifts depending on venue, especially during the civil rights movement, when mainstream newspapers and magazines began hiring black journalists to cover the race beat. In the work of Langston Hughes, Ted Poston, Carl Rowan, and others, I've seen how voice in those writers' hands continues its early function as a powerful tool for advocating on behalf of the black community. Through their manipulation of the first and second person, African-American writers can either unite readers with or isolate them from black identity and experience, which brings stark inequalities into focus. But I see something different happening in Lowery's book. Whereas Rowan and Poston, who wrote for major mainstream dailies for the majority of their careers, regularly foregrounded their black identity, they were black men first and journalists second. Lowery's positioning throughout They Can't Kill Us All is more complex. At points in the narrative, he claims only his professional identity as a reporter. At other points, he is a reporter who happens to be black. Or sometimes, like Rowan and Poston, he is a black man who happens to be a reporter. And whereas Poston and Rowan were using the first and second person either to align with or distance themselves from their readers, in other words, the shifts were outwardly directed, because of Lowery's fluctuating identities, the corresponding shifts in voice are inwardly directed. What this suggests is a kind of double consciousness is at work in Lowery's book. Double consciousness is W.E.B. Du Bois's famous naming of the psychological condition experienced by members of the black community from the slavery era forward. Articulated in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, double consciousness is defined in this way. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. Despite the end of legalized segregation and other significant social and political advances over the last century, the two-ness double consciousness described has remained relevant for the Black community. In 1993, Gerald Early brought out an edited volume called Lure and Loathing, in which 20 prominent African Americans offered their contemporary response to Du Boisian double consciousness. Early thought such a volume was timely, given that it was a period of growing racial conflict in the U.S., a characterization equally applicable 24 years later, and to which Lowery's book attests. Lowery overtly names double consciousness late in his book when he describes Brittany Packnett, a Ferguson protester who so impressed Barack Obama that he asked her to join his task force on 21st century policing. She is someone who, Lowery says, recalls being raised with a double consciousness due to her early access to money and privilege and simultaneous deep pride in her identity as a Black woman. To get at how I see double consciousness working in Lowery's writing, I want to turn briefly to literary theorist Gerard Genet's concepts of the narrator and the narratee. In his groundbreaking work, Narrative Discourse, an essay and method, Genet distinguishes between fictional first-person narrators who play a primary role in the story, as the hero, protagonist, and those who play a secondary role as an observer or witness. Genet acknowledges that in contemporary fiction, the narrator's role can fluctuate between those two roles. To be sure, that happens in Lowery's writing. As narrator, he floats, using Genet's term. At times, he functions as a traditional journalist, often making clear he's relaying information he learned through interviews or research, or received via text or observed. His role is secondary. But other moments, he assumes the position of a central character in the story, which his book's opening indicates. I quote, "Okay, let's take him. Within 2 seconds, 2 officers grabbed me, each seizing an arm, and shoved me against the soda dispenser that rested along the front wall of the McDonald's where I had been eating and working. As I released my clenched hands, my cell phone and notebook fell to the tiled floor. Then came the sharp sting of the plastic zip tie as it was sealed around my hands, pinching tight at the corners of my wrists. I'd never been arrested before, and this wasn't quite how I imagined it would go down." Lowery gained some notoriety in 2014 by being the first journalist to end up in cuffs covering the unrest in Ferguson following Michael Brown's death. But this anecdote does more than acknowledge that. As he details his journalistic tools, cell phone, notebook, he points to the second overt focus of his book. It is a reflection on the role and responsibilities of any professional journalist in covering events that traumatize individuals, the families, and their communities. As that every journalist, Lowery explains how his role was different from those with partisan agendas covering Ferguson. I quote, "My fundamental professional obligation was to fairness and truth. And getting to the truth requires particular attention. As journalists, Lowery later explains, we focus on personal details of the dead, not only because readers want to know, but because we in the media do too, in order to provide as thorough a framing as possible." Yet it is clear that another function of his opening anecdote is to assert his racial identity, as he later announces, "I'm a Black man in America who is often tasked with telling the story of Black men and women killed on American streets by those who are sworn to protect them, but who historically have seen and treated those men, women, and even their children as anything but American." Note there, he's just described the external pressure of the dominant group, the police, that gives rise to double consciousness, the internal experience of warring Black and American identities. This vacillation between observer and actor, what Lowery calls my own role in the chaos, set up in his opening anecdote, continues throughout the book. But it's Jeanette's concept of the narrative that I think best helps to bring Lowery's own double consciousness into focus. Just as a narrator of a fictional story isn't necessarily the author, Jeanette explains, the narrative does not merge a priori with the reader, even an implied reader, especially when the narrator functions from inside the world of the story being told. Because Lowery is telling several stories in his book, the development of the Black Lives Matter movement, the responsibilities of the journalist, and his own role in the chaos, all the while shifting between observing and acting, the narrative is similarly shifting. When Lowery is in the role of the observer, we, the readers, are his narrative. But when he moves to the inside world of the story, he becomes his own narrative. And that is also when we see him wrestling with the relationship between race and professional identity, two warring ideals the book can be read as an effort to resolve. Here's a little more information about Lowery that indicates why double consciousness would be the subtext, even a subject of his book. He's of a recently mixed race background. His mother is white, and his father is black. Growing up, Lowery explains a third of the way through the book. Quote, "We didn't speak directly about race often in our house, but my parents made certain that my two younger brothers and I knew who we were, where we came from," claiming further, "It's hard to doubt your blackness with a middle name like Jabari, which means the bravest." And yet when he recalls going to Cleveland following the shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice and thinks back on his younger self living in Cleveland suburbs, he surmises, "Some of my awkwardness could probably be attributed to the aura of racial ambiguity and confusion I carried with me to Cleveland when I moved there in 8th grade. That ambiguity appears to have continued into the present, as he relates how one activist in Ferguson, upon meeting him, says, I know you said you were light-skinned, but you didn't say you were this light-skinned," a comment that leads to Lowery becoming known as .5 Wes. But .5 or not, Lowery has some credibility. This same activist tweets how excited she is that Lowery will be covering the Ferguson and Mike Brown story the correct way, adding in all caps, "This is love." Is Lowery here linking his credibility to his racial identity? That appears an unsettled question, since his assertions of his professional identity as a journalist frequently omit his racial identity. Those of us among the press, many of us in the media, few reporters, myself included, and a handful of us print reporters, are typical phrases that recur throughout the narrative. And he even tells a story that suggests his credibility could be undermined by too great of an allegiance to his racial identity. He explains how, as a result of his personal distress over the killing of Walter Scott in North Charleston, in an article he described the officer who shot Scott as having planted a stun gun next to Scott's body, which resulted in Lowery being scolded by his editor for using inflammatory language. The editor, Lowery acknowledges, was absolutely right, and he initially blames his misstep on sheer exhaustion. But unable to let exhaustion alone stand as the cause, he reconnects his distress to race. "The dead look like my father, my younger brothers, and me. The way they were dehumanized by cable news talking heads stung me sharply, piercing the layer of emotional detachment I had learned to acquire since being thrust into the story in Ferguson." This battle between identities seems to be waged for the benefit of Lowery as narrative. This kind of double consciousness, racial versus professional, is analyzed in law professor Stephen L. Carter's chapter, "The Black Table, the Empty Seat, and the Tie," in Gerald Early's 1993 book, Law and Loathing, I mentioned earlier. While in law school, Carter and his fellow African-American students sat together in their solidarity corner of the Yale dining hall, debating the question of how we should think of ourselves as black people who happen to be Yale students or as Yale students who happen to be black. That debate, Carter claims, has remained relevant as blacks continue to move into a range of white-dominated professions, or in the case of journalism, white-dominated venues like the Washington Post. To succeed in a profession, he explains, one adopts the profession's ethos, its aesthetics, its culture, and this we see in Lowery's narrative. But while it inevitably leads one to remake significant aspects of oneself, Carter argues that such success need not be an abandonment of one's identity as African American. One can, he argues, choose to claim one's people. This personal or internal claiming of solidarity also has an external effect, as it means accepting, I quote, responsibility of living and working and helping the people with whom one has chosen to identify. They Can't Kill Us All shows Lowery going through the process of making that choice. The book ends with the words of Brittany Packman, who, as I mentioned earlier, Lowery tells us was raised with a double consciousness and functions as a stand-in for him. Here's what she says in Lowery's afterword following more shootings of unarmed Black people in July 2016. We have no choice but to keep going. If one of the central demands of the movement is to stop killing us, and they're still killing us, then we don't get to stop either. By the book's end, Lowery has made the choice to have no choice, and in doing so, makes himself a worthy heir to Ted Poston and Carl Rowan, Black men who happen to be journalists.
I often think that, we've all been part of associations where there's a prize for the person who's traveled the farthest. It wouldn't work for us because it would always be Australia, I guess. But we have a traveler with Miklas-Frankowski is an assistant professor at the Institute of Philosophy, Sociology, and Journalism at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Gdansk, where he teaches courses in literary reportage. In 2016, he was a student at the Polish School of Reportage in Warsaw, founded by the best Polish reportage authors. His main area of research includes contemporary Polish reportage, with particular interest in Polish-Jewish relations, which we're talking about today, and the Jewish issues as well in the work of Milosz. The title of his paper is Poland from the Margins, Marcin Kaki's Białystok, White Power, Black Memory.
Significant title. I start with clear message from Białystok. I remember similar paintings in my city in Gdansk, but they disappeared a long time ago. But they still exist in a provincial town like Białystok and in smaller cities of France. A few words about Mantle. Marcin Kącki is journalist of Gazeta Wyborcza, the most important Polish daily newspaper. He specializes in investigative social and historical journalism. And he's author of two reportage books, La Periada about a populistic politician, and Maestro about children abuse in one of the most famous Polish chores. He received a lot of awards, and he's one of the best journalists, reportage authors, we can say medium generation. Unfortunately, I think that he has been not translated into English. Yeah. Again, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Cover of Białystok. We can see it's typical Polish block plots and graffiti, very nice one. Białystok opens with one of the most shocking reports of the collection and the most tragic episode in the history of the railway line Warsaw-Białystok, whose embankment was rainforest in the 20th century with bodies of children. When trains going to the extermination camp at Treblinka slowed down in U.A.P, desperate parents threw their children out of the cars. There was only one or two windows in a car, small, dark, with barbed wire. You could stick out your head to take some fresh air, stick out your hand for water. You could squeeze a child through. Most of the dropouts died right away, shot by German guards, who later forced Polish residents to bury their bodies in the railway embankment. Today in U.A.P, no one can count how many children's graves the railway embankment conceals. It used to be easier to count because grass would grow more vigorously on them. Green used to be greener. Today, there is no trace of Jewish children buried in the railway embankment. Buried in the nameless graves, they do not have even symbolic tombstone. One of the survivors from among Polish Jews wanted to found a monument to commemorate his family martyrdom during the war. Right-wing council members refused, claiming that a monument for one Jewish family would be too much, and that, after all, there already was an obelisk dedicated to the tragically deceased children. One of the older residents of Łapy and an activist in the Łapy Regional Society takes Kącki to the monument, which was supposed to commemorate Jewish children killed at the railway embankment. But after finding the monument located on the outskirts of the city, it turns out that it bears an inscription, "Scouting to Heroic Polish Children, 1968. The idea was to write to Jewish children, but the party didn't agree. Maybe it's for the best, because soon someone probably devastated, or so it remained like this, the embarrassed tour guide explains. In Łapy, there is no trace of the Jewish inhabitants of the city either. Only the oldest inhabitants remember them. Just only 70-year-old Zbigniew Siwiński remains, saved by his foster Polish mother, who raised him alone, avoiding any talk about its origin. Siwiński celebrates Jewish holidays, and he revealed his Jewishness in the local newspaper, but he wears a kippah only at home. After all, he lives mere 300 meters away from a priest who delivers anti-Semitic sermons. Kącki also manages to find the only survivor of the Łapy dropouts, a beautiful Jewish girl. The whole city has heard of her. Kącki's other interviewers say that they sometimes see her, but others think that she is only unreal urban myth. Yet the survivor herself does not want to talk. She closes the door and leaves Kącki to ask questions. After all this effort, I can't believe it went so easily, because she's wired in some kind of mystery, but I'm going. I'm climbing the stairs, I'm knocking. The door is opened by a short, stout woman looking around 60 years old, slightly slanted, brown, shiny eyes. She must have been a beautiful baby when they untangled her from the clothes which was buried. She must have been a beautiful woman when, under an assumed name, she was hiding to sing the verses of the Polish national anthem. Or maybe not, maybe she's very Jewish, and like Siwiński, she's just celebrating to be Shvat. I have so many questions for you. I'm in the train during the war, I say excited. She cringes as if caught in a painful secret. Quietly but firmly, she refuses and shuts the door. I walk down, and starts feeling down. After all these talks and fudging, a Jewish girl saved by brave people just closes the door. I walk out of the building. I want to go back upstairs once again. On the wall of a neighboring building, I see spray painted swastikas, each a meter big. The little rescued Jewish girl also sees them every day. Kącki's book is a reporter's attempt to answer a question of what happened to the medical coverage from Podlasie, dominated by burning apartments, swastikas on walls, anti-Semitism, racism, and football hooliganism. With these questions in mind, how was it possible in a place where Poles, Belarusians, Tatars, and Jews have lived side by side for centuries, he runs the whole Podlasie? But he gives the most space to the regional capital, the title Białystok. According to Kącki, Białystok is primarily a town which has a problem of identity, because after the war, it has written its history without a menorah and a mezuzah, which is most conspicuously symbolized by Central Park, the city's landmark, assessed by 5 most frequented streets connected with the largest roundabout in the city. 3 hectares of high-lying trees, maple trees, main paths, many benches, playground for children. In winter, the park is used as a science field, a year-round attraction. In 2014, Tomasz Wiśniewski made a short film to make the residents aware that under the park there is a Jewish cemetery. Under tons of solid hundreds of Jewish matzeva stand upright, and under them human remains wrapped on shrouds. All of this, the work of a city architect, Michał Bałasz, who didn't know what to do with the ruined cemetery. Just the rubble, these ghosts, and even drunkards shot on this gravestone. Nobody watched. To be honest, let me tell you, I felt sorry for cemetery, but nobody thought about digging it up, moving it somewhere. I came up with an idea to cover it. Kącki wonders whether the cemetery was covered with rubble from the ghetto, or maybe from the burned down synagogue, in which about 2,000 people were burnt alive. In 1973, when the memory of the former purpose of the place begins to fade, a monument to the heroes of the Białystok land fallen in the struggle for people's Poland was erected on a park hill opposite the seat of the provincial committee. After 1989, people liked less and less the relics of the Polish ideology. In 2007, the monument changes into its name to White Eagle, and in 2011, a group of veterans attached meter-high letters to the monument to make the inscription "God, Honor, Father." Although they act illegally, no one has the courage to take the inscription off, and each next card dismisses the case. The Jewish cemetery begins exactly at the place of a motto which, in the common mind, is not associated with patriotism or military tradition, but with the Polish national right-wing circles, usually refers to other groups, especially ethnic minorities. Before the war, Jews accounted for half of the inhabitants of Białystok, 50,000 in 100,000 cities, and were the most important sociocultural tissue of the city. The marketplace and the center were all Jewish. It was Jewish who built this town, who actually made it involved in the civilization machine. The Jews were Białystok, and now they are hardly present in the architectural space of the city or in memory of its current inhabitants. This clearly follows from the research by sociologist Kathleen, who states that the resource became a memento of communities living in Białystok in the past, mostly Jews, but also Germans or Russians, are now completely marginalized. And the awareness of the legacy of this group among the contemporary inhabitants of Białystok is negligible. It's a domination of the symbolical largest group over minority ones. A domination whose eloquent symbol is written in the motto God, Honor, Fatherland on the side of a Jewish cemetery. For the present-day resident of Białystok, the world's most famous inhabitant of Białystok, Ludwik Zamenhof, is not a reason to be proud of. Over the years, he was not commemorated except for his street name on the school, only till 2001. Only in 1974, a modest bust of the creator of Esperanto was unveiled. When in 2009, the World Esperanto Congress took place in Białystok, the hostile atmosphere intensified and anti-Semitic comments appeared on the internet. Before the Congress, an empty tent for Esperantists was set on fire. Then Zamenhof's old school, visited by Esperantists, was pelted with stones. Someone punctured tires in the bus of the Czech delegation parked outside the school. During the Congress, Zamenhof's center was set on fire, and a young boy put pink paint on his bus under passers-by their eyes. Professor Andrzej Sadowski explained to Kącki that for Białystok inhabitants, Zamenhof is not a creator of universal language, which was supposed to bridge the gap between nations, but he is simply a Jew. The inhabitants of Podlasia are folk communities who developed their identity in the countryside, where the concept of ours versus alien dominated, and the Jew from the town was alien, an innkeeper, a salesman, a banker. But anti-Semitism does not exalt all xenophobic behaviors listed in Białystok. One should mention the described by Kącki in the football hooligans, skinheads who are responsible for many usually dismissed misdemeanors and crimes, racial assaults and arson, as well as drowning swastikas on walls, which a famous Podlasia court prosecutor interpreted as Hindu symbols of happiness and prosperity. Kącki also tracks down relationships between Białystok business economy football club and the city authorities. In the option of xenophobia, nationalism, and anti-Semitism, Kącki also finds people who resist the pervasive historical oblivion and void, who fight with incomprehension and intolerance, community workers, scholars, culture animators, defenders of women, architecture, LGBT activists, people who selflessly monitor racism and xenophobic graffiti on walls and on the internet. Some of them were forced to leave Białystok and Podlasia, others are becoming more active against all odds. Kącki has made Zamenhof's idea the composition bridge of Białystok. The book began with a condensed picture of his life. Ludwik Zamenhof, a sickly teenager, goes out to a bustling market in front of his home in Białystok. He sees Jews, Poles, Tatars, Belarusians, Germans, they're becoming fist fights. He listens to the language tumult, which hinders understanding. In the little Ludwig's head, an idea sprouts that all nations and fights should be connected by language, common, accepted, neutral. A dozen years later, he writes the first Esperanto textbook. At the end of his life, on the canvas of World War I still under, he believes that people can still communicate, yet they need humanitarianism, freedom from blind service to a nation, which turns into chauvinism, and blind obedience to the clergy, which turns into fanatism. Zamenhof's last words are probably the main reason for which, also according to Kącki, the dark memory and the white power so heavily appropriated Białystok and Podlasia. Unfortunately, the ending of the entire book does not sound optimistic at all. Zamenhof's idea of people living in harmony, symbolically contained in Esperanto, was carved on golden plate in 1977 and placed in the space probe Voyager with greetings of alien civilization. The probe passed the solar system. It's 20 billion kilometers away from Białystok, and it's constantly visible. Marcin Kącki managed to create an impressive, multifaceted anthropological case study of the society of a contemporary provincial Polish city. Białystok is the place of collective amnesia and repression of Jewish history of the city where no Nazi symbols are widely tolerated. From Kącki books emerges both multifaceted history of a city without memory and the shape of our Polish national community with xenophobia, nationalism, and anti-Semitism, And one more picture, it's got 1,000 more. Kącki writing about this organization, which is quite strong in Białystok. And half year after he published his book, Oilner organized march through the main city. It was the first time they organized march to the big city, and march ended in the mass in the most important Białystok church. And just 3 weeks ago, we had a similar march in Warsaw. So it's so significant, you know. It's a royal route. It's the main road in Warsaw, and you know what happened in Poland during the Second World War. And I'd like to end with a quotation from Susan Greenberg from the last IALJS newsletter. Just the 2 last sentences. At that time, the problem of mythic nationalism was posed as a counterpoint to the co-option of socialist realism on larger retrospective basis. Now, Polish reportage must face the challenge again as a part of its future. In my opinion, this is one of many examples that Polish literary reportage faces the challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. While she's getting set up, I just want to say I just met our final speaker, Kathleen with Wickham, and she has a reason to celebrate. I'll explain in a minute. She has a book that's no longer forthcoming, or it's here, it's right here. Let me know when you're ready. Kathleen is a professor of journalism at the University of Mississippi, where she teaches writing for magazines and newspapers, and of course on press coverage of civil rights. She's also lectured at the Sorbonne. Here's the book.
It's a book.
Yeah. At Rennes University in France, she's author of this book, We Believe We Were Immortal, 12 reporters who covered the 1962 integration crisis at Ole Miss. Along with publishing numerous articles, she's published 3 other books and has judged the National Headline of Journalism Award since 2010. The title of her paper, as you can see, is Civil Rights Newsmagazine Coverage Narrative of This Story.
If I could get that in slide, but that's okay. Okay, so this is definitely a work in progress. The last of my data came in Friday. It's finals week. So I had a busy, a couple of hours, but the focus is on news magazines. So much of what I've been doing in the past is focused on newspapers and actually focusing in particular on the stenographic work that you see in the New York Times and comparing it to Southern newspapers and how they compared their civil rights events across the South. Working on the book, I became really fascinated by stories that I was reading in Look and Life magazine, and I saw a whole different approach to covering those events. Of course, they were not tied to daily journalism, and so this is part of that larger project, and definitely a work in progress. And what I had my class this spring on President South, we looked at Life Look, which were the big picture book magazines, Time, Newsweek, Saturday Evening Post, Jet, and Ebony, and U.S. News and World Report, and we wanted to determine to what extent figurative language, description, nuance, and voice appeared in these publications. We know that most magazines are singly written, whatever, but there are multiple contributors, so you seldom see a byline. So ascertaining a specific author is going to be really challenging in some of these publications. We took as our range from the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, ordering the desegregation of public schools through the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That's just the parameters. The actual dates that one looks at for civil rights era changes slightly depending on some different sources. But really, what we looked at with Thomas Conley's thesis statement that researchers need to move away from analyzing literary journalism primarily as literary art and see it more as a cultural way of knowing. And I think I saw some of those Rebecca's, on your paper, and I'm like, I'd like to read that paper in more depth. Middle-class readers in the 1950s and 60s turned to news magazines for photography, storytelling, and a vision of middle-class life promised in the post-World War II years. They provided intense coverage and served as both cultural repositories of art and artifact, written in styles far removed from the more stenographic style of the New York Times. And as Michael Shudson has noted, they serve as reminders of who we are and what we're about. And we're looking into, we have some information on who exactly they were looking for. Life and Look focus on photographs and features. The Saturday Evening Post was mostly feature, writing very upbeat. Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report focused on straight news. And Jet and Ebony provided black readers with coverage of issues important to African Americans and often ignored mainstream publications, but both mimic the legacy of traditional news weeklies by providing stories for their middle-class audiences or aspirational audiences. And I love this quote from Alabama Governor George Wallace. You're reading it ahead of me. No, cheating. Time magazine is for people who can't think. Life magazine is for people who can't read. And the Saturday Evening Post is for people who can't read or think. We'll get more on that later. So we use both quantitative techniques to generate some statistical knowledge of the selected publications and sort of to guide me as to where we're going forward. And we use, we're going to be using textual analysis to understand the broader implications. And these were the most significant news magazines published at that time. The 10 events we chose were Emmett Till's murder, the Montgomery bus protest, integration of Little Rock Central High School, the Freedom Ride, James Meredith's integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962, which resulted in a riot, violence in Birmingham, the March on Washington, Mississippi Freedom Summer, and the adoption of Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and the Selma Voting Campaign. None of the magazines are the same, either structurally or in concept, leading to arguments about how they could be viewed through the same lenses. So we looked at Greenberg and Wheelwright, and he really tackled that challenge. He said, by looking at through ethics and, as he said, the 3 dimensions, we looked at both on the, I can't talk this morning, I have a very bad sore throat. So the scientific method of investigative journalism, models that contribute to public understanding and the writing. And hopefully that will drive the project as we keep going forward. So the question is, how does literary journalism relate to civil rights coverage? It became another venue through which the social and cultural revolution became known as the civil rights movement reached American homes. By casting it in narrative and storytelling, the middle-class readers gained knowledge that they might not have gained through the local newspapers and through television coverage. Television coverage was in its infancy during most of his venue. It wasn't until, I think, 1963 that network television was available in all 48 contiguous states. So that became an important issue on some of these issues. The significance can be noted when New York University compiled a list of the top 100 news stories in the 20th century. 41 of them were classified as literary journalism, which shows the importance of newspapers alone, not just news magazines. When the new journalism of the 1960s and 1970s shared with the 1930s and 1890s version, was it developed a response to a significant social and cultural transformations and crisis. So we looked at Moss's study into newspaper news frames in the black and white press, and we found that there were specific themes of patriotism, moderation, law and order, violence, racism and ethnocentrism, and constitutional issues. The enduring values of journalism coverage. She concluded that the white press focused on moderation and law and order, while the black press focused on constitutional issues. And that question comes into play as we looked at Jet and Ebony, which were the black publications of the time period. Funkhauser, another theorist we used, also used framing theory to examine coverage of race relations in urban riots, his term, in Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. And he found that among his topics, the highest number of articles, 556 urban riots, was ranked 9th. So it was certainly a dominant theme in coverage. So my researchers developed a standard code book. We trained them. We rewrote the code book a few times. The researchers included 5 women and 3 men. 2 coders were African American, 1 man and 1 woman. And what the challenge was to code the most prominent story about the event, was one in which events were wrapped up for the reader in a comprehensive story. And that, of course, is with news magazines not stuck to daily deadlines. We were aware that not all their coverage would necessarily be event connected, but rather be unpacked subsequently 3 months later from news magazines. And of course, we use library resources, microfilm and bound copies in all my databases. And anyhow, we ended up with 80 articles. That was the good news. 80 articles. That was a lot of stuff that I have to go through. So our first research question, what literary prototypes dominated in each publication? And I'm not using numbers because I haven't had a chance to verify the numbers, but this is what the trends were. Individual versus society followed by conflict were the most dominant themes that we found. The second research question, what news frames dominated violence and constitutionality, and there's a reason for some of that. To what extent were literary journalism elements present, description and narration? Really no surprise when you look at most magazine stories that they are heavy on those terminology. We also wanted to determine the tone of the article toward the protagonist and their goals, and for the most part they coded them as being supportive. And that may be a bit of a conflict, but that's what we came up with. And the 5th question was, we wanted to determine the role of the narrator, and we found a lot of internal vocalization, not a call to action in the stories that we looked at. So it's not surprising that violence and constitutionality were the dominant frames. Civil rights stories were about strife, and many of the selected stories focused on riots and robust demonstrations. That's my polite word. Research indicates that these themes are fairly consistent in the early days of protest movements, that like many people like to say that the media is liberal and pushes the agenda of rioters and protesters, but in truth what you really find out is that there's a strong emphasis on law and order issues rather than a more liberal take on the position is right, so therefore we're going to cover it. Here we have a view from Carl Fleming, who was a Newsweek reporter, and Carl said, this is what it was like to cover civil rights stories. Black people were treated terribly. They simply didn't have rights. That was an objective fact. There were no 2 sides to an issue. It was simply wrong. I'm not suggesting that we weren't fair. We were scrupulously fair. We had to be. I'm not saying that the way the facts can come down that made the Southern white institution look as if it had fallen down the job, which it had. That was a fact. We knew the moral weight was on the other side of the fence. So there was an intense, scrupulous effort to make absolutely sure that the so-called other side got its day in court. So our literary journalism frames. Magazine stories allow for more latitude for the writer than do newspaper stories, hence the results are consistent with previous research. Description and narration with a focus on people as opposed to institutions, and a frame of right versus wrong contributed to the results. Fleming's description of the out-of-town writers had descended on the University of Mississippi in 1962, an example description, narration, and tone common in civil rights stories. This is what Fleming wrote on that event. The resistance fighters arriving were rough-looking, snow-seeing characters, many with angry faces and sagging bellies and a variety of working clothes. Boy, that is description. He linked the troublemakers to the characters in Faulkner's novels, because William Faulkner had died 3 months before the riot broke out in Knoxville, Mississippi. 1 minute. All right, I think I can do it. Life, the publication was viewed as liberal for its coverage and its emphasis on the root causes of civil rights violence. Look, wrote about what mattered in the world. They personalized the stories. They covered the events that received the most attention in the traditional press, but did little to advance the story. Ebony, most civil rights stories focus on good versus evil frames, with a news frame emphasis on moderation. Jet sought to empower African Americans through stories written about the quest for civil rights. The dominant news frames were good versus evil, law and order, violence, and constitutional issues. Time relied significantly on narration for their reports, but they were strongly a law and order news frame. Newsweek, the stories had a strong narrative thread. Its prose was more artful than that which appeared in Time, giving it an appearance as being more lightweight. And for the Saturday Evening Post, the majority of the Post stories included hefty doses of description, 80%, and focus on the news frame of individual versus society. The writing was upbeat. Done.
I'll start us out. Thank you all, first of all, really for good stuff. I wanted to talk a little bit about race and writing about race, and to understand where each of you are coming a little bit. It seems to me that Rachel, one of the things you're trying to do is sort of say that there's a tactic or a strategy to put identity, in the center of what literary journalism does. But it seems to me that Roberta's also talking about a kind of a mixed thing that happens when that happens. So I wonder if you each could talk a little bit about that. The other thing I thought about here in Kathleen's paper is you're thinking about these journals that are marked by racial demographics, like that, right? In a sense, you're taking the race of the reporters out, right? And so I know you probably thought a lot of that in your own work. And how do you think that this plays into the reporting on civil rights or on Black Lives Matter? What are the risks of and places where racial identity can be put into the stories that you've been following?
Are you going to start?
No.
Oh.
I'm still catching my breath.
Okay. Are you going to start?
Well, the two pieces I looked at in particular, Gloria Anzaldua's work, La Frontera, in terms of where you can put race in literary journalism, I hearken to that text because it represents her hybrid identity, right? Like it represents her identity as both a Chicana woman, a Latina woman, and an American woman. And so, I mean, my immediate instinct is to kind of look at that interesting way that she uses form and then to pull that into literary journalism now and to represent that in like current literary journalism.
Well, in the work that I've been doing over the last several years. Its venue is very, very important. When journalists are working in black publications, the assumption of identity, racial identity, is there.
From the staff, from the editorial staff.
From the reader, from everybody. You know, and what happens in mainstream publication, there's a dual audience, and it's a very, what I've seen is a very interesting negotiation. It depends on what the goal is for the piece, and as I was suggesting before with somebody like Ted Poston, go back and forth purposefully in order to engage the reader or separate the reader. And Carl Rowan does that as well in his books that came out of his reporting for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. And I was interested in what Kathleen was saying about how the stories were individually focused rather than looking to be calls for action. And I've seen that in Rowan's work, and it's very individualized, but it strikes me as a necessary first step toward action, toward getting the larger audience to identify with the situation or recognize their distance from the situation, so that change in attitude can prompt action, so that race is very, very important in something like that, but he moves toward it and away from it. Yeah. So it strikes me as extremely complicated, and depending on venue and purpose and time, there's a lot of shifting.
I was thinking of Dorothy Gilliam, who was the first African American woman hired by the Washington Post, and she was hired just several months before the immigration crisis at the University of Mississippi. And she was not allowed to come cover the riot, even though she had covered Little Rock and had been at other civil rights venues, because her editors feared for her safety. And instead they sent white reporters. But Dorothy came a week later, and her task was to get the reaction of the black community for the Washington Post. And she nailed it in her story that she wrote for the following Sunday, because among the people she talked to was actually James Meredith's parents, who would not have talked to a white reporter. And along those same lines, on that event, black reporters for Baltimore Afro-American and Jimmy Hicks, Amsterdam.
Moses News.
No, Moses Newsom was Afro-American, and Jimmy Hicks was from New York. They weren't even allowed on campus. Law enforcement banned them from being on campus. So there you have a major civil rights event, and the black voice was not heard for their own safety, which may have been a law and order value issue. So that's, and they talked about how important it was to have the black voice, and that Chet and Ebony were the venue.
And the Black Lives Matter coverage, Wesley Lowery had some special access to family homes, and he was there at very, very important events, and I think it was because of the cultural racial identification. At least that's the subjects that comes through in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the conditions of his arrest, but was he discounted as a journalist because of his racial identity, for instance, or was he identified as implicit? You know,
it's very interesting, and I hope I suggested it in my paper. You can't quite tell. There were two people arrested. He was the first arrested. The second was a reporter for the Huffington Post who was arrested, and he was a white reporter. But he was the first reporter. And so first, race isn't an issue, but then it comes in. So he's going back and forth with it throughout the book, and that, as I suggest in that opening anecdote. So no, it was just the police just not wanting any reporters to have anything to do with it. They wanted them out of it, but then race becomes an issue in it.
Yeah, I think that you made a very good point about this double consciousness of how, this double identity is always playing in the book. I was not aware of this author, but I would like to know if in his narrative he's also showing somehow this, if his physical identity or his appearance also affects the way that the others will act towards him, or if that influences somehow his stories. Because I'm thinking also about, in the case of women, and how the author you mentioned also, I think that could be related with that, how women reporters, well, maybe now that it's more common to say that, but in this time, in the 50s or 60s, was so, there were so few women reporters that also they try to cover different stories or talk with people that maybe male reporters would not approach. So maybe in this case, we are talking about also questions of identity, of how you relate with the informants in a different way. I don't know if that is shown in the narrative. Sorry.
So are you asking me if Lowery suggests because of his racial identification? It's subtle, but yes, I would say that it does, again, it gives him, he suggests it gives him some access at some moments, but it's very important when he highlights that he was 0.5 West. You know, that was, he was black, but he's not that black in appearance, but, so it's very, very interesting positioning, and I think I think that the book functions in a way as a novel, and that by the end, I think he's working out his relationship to the community through this reporting, and he does decide he's 1.0 West by the end of the book. So, but certainly his physical appearance at times does give him access and credibility, and his alignment with the community does give him. I mean, it's his cultural identity more than his physical identity that gives him access, I think.
And research indicates that within newsrooms, black reporters are more likely to have black sources, and females are more likely to have female sources, which is why there's a significant call for commitment to diversity within our newsrooms, and that we should become more assertive in expanding our source list and not just go to people who look like us.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point that I think it's also good to do more research on. Also for Kathleen, I have studied some magazines from that time in Latin America that were using a lot this model of the time, and I realized that, I don't know if it's the case in your research, that these magazines were more actually changing or the lifestyle of their readers, or trying to construct, propose new ways of seeing modern life than the opposite. I don't know if in this case, well, but of course they were also trying to bring them the model of the first world lifestyle to Latin America, so maybe it's a different thing. But I don't know how much these magazines were also trying not only to show the everyday life of middle class people in the U.S., but also trying to change that or trying to influence their beliefs.
I think one thing I read said that it had to do more with the ads that were in the magazines that were more aspirational for the readers. And then, of course, then the stories were also, depending on the publication, more about successful people, and this is how you achieve a modern post-World War II upper middle class society if you dress the right way. And from reading this, I realized why today we kind of view New York Times as the national newspaper. Back then it really wasn't, and and that is really the magazines like Light and Look that came into your living rooms that served more as that informing people significantly onto what life is like in the South, because more people read Life and Look than the New York Times, and so they have a significant role.
I just want to pick up on that point. Women reporters have mainly female sources. Is that from your research? Or
No,
what
it's research I read.
I simply can't believe that. I just find that.
Well, men are more likely to just call on male sources, and women just are more likely to go to see validity in a woman. And I'm sorry, I can't give you this site.
I find that
but I'll
really.
dig it out
Can
if
you
send
find
me
it
an
for me?
email.
Because I find that really hard to believe, just from my own experience and experience of colleagues. It just doesn't seem viable. But interesting. Thank you. Cultural.
You know, Jen, I wondered too, also with your project that wasn't clear about Kachi's own identity and how it would play into such a super repeated climate as you're talking about, where I thought you were doing a superb job trying to think about the kind of complicated vectors about anti-Semitism and nationalism and religious orthodoxy, all kind of converging on this kind of monumental suppression. It was extraordinary. And I'm just wondering where the position of Kachi's own identity is in this. What does he claim to be? What is he, in the school of reportage that you're working on with? I mean, how does he position himself as? Does he come in as I'm a Polish national? You know, how does that work for him?
He was described with his strategy, of annoying fly. It's a quite difficult question, but I think that his advantage is he really try to understand, and he tried to spot the conversation even with people so different from him, like these people from other nationalities, from neo-Nazis movement. But his position, yes, well, there was a question. His intention was clearly mentioned. Try to understand what happened, because before Second War, it was multicultural region.
Yeah.
This south of Poland. And now Poland is not quite, as you know, homogenical country, and we have anti-Semitism. We have no Jews. So it's very
Would he be regarded as an outsider, for instance, or would he be regarded as having a special? We say axe to grind, you know, a special point of view that would.
So I think we have what it's important because we now in Poland, as you maybe you saw it in the pictures, because you know government allow for this march through Warsaw. So there is some they want to live good with this nationalistic movement for various reasons. And since first in our parliament we have representatives of this movement. It's not parliament. So it's first time after war finished. After war finished. So we are in Poland. We can after Tomasz Gosnow we have about Jedwabne, neighbors book. It was 2001, and I think we struggle for our memory, our identity, and on the one side the government and not many some people from east of Poland who were more conservative, more religious, and their narration who now is our government tried to impose to everywhere, to schools, to the museums, that we had to be proud from our history. For example, Polish were only victims during the war. So, but it's typical nationalistic narration, building community, building on common values, common moral issues. And we have the second side. So
So you're saying, I think I said, mourning, like those monuments to the Polish victims supplant and replace the victims underneath the mounds and so on. That's wonderful.
Yes, this battle, this struggle for memory, one of the monuments, or one of the issue in the struggle for memory. Always, when we had a lot of in Gdansk, we had a lot of German monuments, and that all they were moved. So, after 89, it's quite an sociologist to do this research. It's very interesting because it's like symbolic communication.
Well, as you know, in the American South, I mean, right now this is an issue about replacing monuments.
And after 89, we replacing monuments of Stalin, Lenin, and not Stalin, but Lenin.
So like what memories are we replacing them with?
Now we changed the name of streets and.
One thing I also, Roberta, I thought about your piece is that, you're coming into it as a literary critic and you're sort of thinking about double consciousness. There's a testimonial tradition back there too, right, in that American, about witnessing and this kind of thing, which is through that. The other thing that I think of, this came up a little bit in Bill's panel too, in the indigenous reporting thing, which is that, if you were looking at this as an ethnography story, say, or like, folks coming from the north to look at the south, what is the south? That's the story you're telling about Wesley is sort of an initiation story itself, right? It's a story that you find in ethnographies a lot, where, I went to look and I was hit over the head. Prison narratives are like this old, right? And so, in a curious way, you could say he's using some of those traditions to kind of authenticate and fend off the charge of racial sympathy, but so he can kind of keep his journalistic authority, but not.
I also think that what he's doing, and there's no room to do that here, is reaching back to a tradition with Douglas and Du Bois. Is a bit of an ambassador. He's moving between worlds, and that's very witnessing, as you're saying, and communicating, drawing people in. I mean, it's a very interesting positioning that he's doing in the book, and it operates on many different levels.
Yeah, I mean, I just think back to Rachel's and Jan was talking about bodies, where the body's buried, but also how witnessing is a long tradition of taking into your body the physical violence that you're seeing. It's like, I'd be interested to see how you code that, and
When you think about the initiation story, I mean, Douglas's narrative is an initiation story, and of our spiritual strivings, you've got Du Bois's own initiation story, and yes, and Lowery is signaling that tradition. I would agree overtly with an initiation story here as well. So.
Okay. Thank you all for
In case you wanted to have flyers about the availability of